He stood there. He stood there defiant and determined. That is, as defiant and determined as a 5-year-old can stand on just the second day of a new school year. The physical education teacher, a very experienced and excellent teacher, has just marched the young lad into my office. "Here, sit in this chair," the teacher ordered. But the lad just stood there, refusing to budge. 2 or 3 more commands were given for this strong-willed young boy to have a seat, but to no avail. And then the physical ed teacher looked at me and said, "I thought he needed to come to you. He hasn't cooperated in PE class at all. He won't do anything I ask him to do." And with that, the PE teacher left my office, and there I was sitting behind my principal's desk with this strong-willed, defiant 5-year-old boy sizing me up. I got up from my desk, walked around. I squatted down to get eye to Craig, and I said, "Craig, you're going to sit in this chair." And he didn't budge. And so I, of greater stature and strength, lifted, not roughly, but lifted Craig up and sat him in the chair. So there, we'll see who's in charge here. And I began to question this young little lad, this new kid in school, just the second day of school. And I had not gotten to know him or his family. And I wondered why he was so defiant and so self-willed and so unwilling to cooperate. And so I began to talk to him and ask him some of the usual questions about the importance of cooperation and obedience, but somehow I didn't seem to be getting through. So I thought, well, maybe this little lad has never been away from home. Maybe he's an only child. Maybe he's just never been around a group. So he doesn't understand the importance that when you're in a larger group, you got to have rules and guidelines and procedures. And so I thought I would try that strategy. And I said, "Craig," I said, "there's a lot of other children in the class besides yourself, aren't there?" He said, "No." And I said, "There aren't other kids in your class?" And he said, "No." And I said, "You haven't seen the other kids in your class?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Let's go take a look at the other kids in your class since you haven't seen them." "I won't go," he said. I said, "I'll just pick you up and carry you then if you think you won't go. And then you'll see the kids." And he said, "I'll close my eyes." With this, I swept this determined 5-year-old up into my arms and headed down the hall to the first classroom, his own kindergarten classroom. And as we stepped through the door, I had him in my arms, and I stepped there, and I opened the door for him to see the kids in the class, and he turned his head the other way, so I wouldn't see them. But I, of greater experience and wisdom, I said, "Now you see the kids there?" And he turned his head. I just spun around so he would see the kids. And, of course, he jerked his head back the other way so he wouldn't see the kids. I said, "Let's go see some of the other kids in the school, Craig." So I headed down to the next classroom, and as I got ready to open the door to see the kid, I knew what he was going to do, right? I knew when I opened the door he was going to turn, so I said, "Now, Craig, do you see the kids in that classroom?" So as he turned his head, he found himself looking at the kids. Well, we played this little game at one more classroom. I went back to my office, and I realized I still had this very self-willed, defiant young lad. So after a few more minutes of talking and his unwilling to acknowledge he would cooperate, I said, "I think I need to call your mother and let her have a talk with you." "You don't know her number," he said. I said, "Well, I know a lot more than you think I know, Craig." So within a minute, I had his mother on the phone. I kind of explained the situation to her, and so I handed the phone to Craig. And so for several minutes there, as I sat at my desk, and Craig and his mother were on the phone for several minutes of conversation, although Craig didn't say much, but they talked for several minutes. And then he handed the phone back to me. His mother apologized and said that she was really sorry for his behavior, that that if he didn't cooperate going forward, to let her know, and she would come get him, pick him up from school if necessary. And that after that, I asked Craig, I said, are you ready to go back to class and cooperate with your teacher now? And to my surprise, he said yes. And so I took Craig back to his classroom, and the school day continued on. And after school that day, as my custom was, I would go outside where parents are picking up cars are coming through, and this was actually at a school in the city in Chicago, and so parents would actually drive through an alley and that was between our school and our parking lot and pick up their kids, and I would be out there greeting parents and supervising, making sure everybody was safe as the kids got in the car and left. And so as the kids are coming and going and parents are picking up kids and I'm there kind of watching, little Craig that same day, that afternoon, came running up to me and said, "Can you pick me up the way you did earlier?" And I was like really surprised. But I thought, anything I can do to build a positive rapport with this young lad would probably be worth doing. So I picked Craig up, and I had my nice shirt and tie on, and I was looking all nice, and I picked Craig up, and I held him right here, and he just waved with the smiling from ear to ear. He just waved at his friends and said, "Timmy, look at me. Hi, Susie, look at me," as if he was so proud to be held there by the principal, up looking down on the other kids as they left. And I thought maybe he's just proud to be held by someone. And as I set him down, I noticed that my shirt was just where he had been on my side here. He had twisted and twisted and twisted, waving at kids. My shirt looked like somebody had taken my shirt and just done that to it. All messed up. Well, it was the next day when I got a call from Craig's mother to see. I was sitting in my office, and his mother called, and she said, "Do you have a few minutes?" And I said, "Sure." She wanted to call and see how Craig was doing, and she said, "Can I tell you about Craig?" And I said, "Yes." So this is what she told me about Craig. Craig's parents are divorced. His mother is an alcoholic and a drug addict. His father has been abusive. Craig was living with his father in the Dominican Republic, but they had no home. They lived literally on the streets. They were homeless. Neither parent wanted the children. And so finally the father decided to give Craig and his sister away. Neither parent wanted them. Neither parent could take care of them. They were just going to give them away to whoever would take them. That's when my husband and I decided we had to do something, she said. As quickly as we could, we arranged to adopt them and brought them home to live with us. You see, Craig's father is my brother, and I couldn't just let the children be thrown away. When we first got them, Craig was horrible. When he got mad, he would throw things around the house and break things. Sometimes if he got mad at us, he would purposely urinate on himself. He does not respond to force. No matter what you do to him or no matter what you threaten to him, he will not budge until he decides to do so. So I just talk to him, she says. Sometimes I just talk to him until I'm blue in the face before he will finally give in and do what I ask. We've only had the children for 1 year, but you would not believe how far Craig has come. It's really a miracle. But as you can see, he still has that strong will. I hope he can make it in your school. We want him to have that Christian environment so bad. If he's too much trouble, though, just call me anytime. I can talk with him over the phone, and if necessary, I'll come get him. As I hung up the phone, I swallowed long and hard. I recalled him asking me to pick him up after school the day before, and even though my shirt looked a terrible mess, I was so glad I had picked him up. That day, after school, Craig came excitedly up to me again and asked me to pick him up. Well, I had an important meeting that afternoon, and I really needed to look. I was meeting some people. I needed to look, presentable and professional. And I hesitated for about a second or two, and after a second or two, I just reached down and swooped him up in my arms again and picked him up. And once again, he waved and smiled and so proud to be held by the principal there. he called out to different friends. I held him a little tighter and pressed a little more, tried to press as much love and warmth into him as I could. And it occurred to me that day, and I said to myself, I guess my shirts will just have to be wrinkled this year. What the world needs is love. Many of us that are older at least remember that very popular song, I think from the 70s. It might have come out in the 60s. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing that there's just too little of. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. And I believe that's what Jesus said too. What the world needs now, what the church needs now, is love. Let us pray. Father God, as we open your word, please anoint us with your Spirit and fill our hearts with your love. Please anoint me now as I share this message, that your Spirit will speak to all of us through your word and through your love. In Jesus' name, amen. You know, I originally titled this sermon The 11th Commandment, and I switched the title to A New Commandment. You know, we know that there are 10 commandments, and the 10 commandments, God's law does not change. Isaiah 40 verse 8 says, the grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God endures forever. And Peter quotes that verse as well himself in 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 24. And Jesus said, I did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law. Till heaven and earth shall pass, not one jot, not one tittle shall by any means pass from this law. The law of God stands forever. The 10 commandments are infallible and unchangeable. But at the same time, Jesus himself said, a new commandment I give you. In John 13, verses 34 and 35, we read, Jesus says, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. As I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. I will remind you that when Jesus said this, it was the night before he died on the cross for you and me. Let me say that again, the night before he died on the cross. When a man knows that he's going to die within a few hours, he chooses his words carefully. And Jesus had much to say to his disciples on this night, desperately still trying to help them to see the real purpose of his life, of his mission, of the Messiah. I've shared with you before, if anyone questions if Jesus had much to say on that night, that if you look in the Gospel of John, and if your Bible has the words of Jesus in red, you will see that in John 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17, almost all of it is in red. That's 5 chapters, all spoken by Jesus on the night before his crucifixion to his disciples. Now, we need to consider the Gospels are about the life of Jesus, and the book of John has 21 chapters. That's 5 chapters. That's nearly 25% of the book is what Jesus said that night to his disciples. Jesus had much to say, but paramount, there are several themes actually. There are several themes that weave through John 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 as Jesus spoke with his disciples that last night before his crucifixion. There are several themes, but paramount was love and unity. And he spoke repeatedly about love and unity. And of course, in John 17 is that great prayer that he pleaded for unity among his people, that we would be as one, just as Jesus and the Father are one, that we would be as one like they are, and we would be one in them and them in us. That's the kind of love and unity Jesus wants to see in his church. And how do people know if we are God's people or God's church? Jesus says, by this, all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one to another. The defining characteristic of Christ's followers is love. Not the Sabbath, not the second coming, not the 2300-year prophecy, not tithing. Those are all important doctrines, teachings of the Bible, important things that should be a part of God's church, God's remnant church. We'll preach the truth. We'll be the pillar and ground of truth. We'll be Sabbath keepers. We'll be looking to the second coming. But the defining, recognizable characteristic, Jesus says, by this, all will know that you are my disciples. Not if you keep the Sabbath perfectly or you do this, but if you have love one for another. This is how they will know you are my disciples. How important is love? You know, Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 12 talk about spiritual gifts. And in 1 Corinthians 12, Paul is elaborating on spiritual gifts and how the Spirit gives to each one as he wills. And we have different spiritual gifts among us, but we're all part of one body. And if one part of the body is hurting or ill, the whole body suffers. And he uses that symbolic of the church, God's church. If one member is not using their spiritual gifts, the body of Christ is suffering. But when he goes through this chapter and he talks about spiritual gifts, he closes chapter 12 by saying, but earnestly desire the best gifts, and yet I will show you a more excellent way. And then he moves into what we call 1 Corinthians 13, known as the greatest love chapter in the Bible. And notice what Paul says as he's talked about spiritual gifts, and he says, let me show you a better way. He says, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I have become a sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift, now he's been talking about spiritual gifts, so he's not talking about a psychic here. He's not talking about things like that. He is talking about the spiritual gift of prophecy from God, a gift of prophecy, a gift from God to know the future and to prophesy. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, these are gifts. Though I have the gift to prophesy the future from God, and I have all understanding and all knowledge, and I have all faith so that I can even move mountains, but have not love, I'm nothing. How important is love? And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned. This is a martyr. This is someone that dies for Jesus Christ. This is one who says, I will die before I will give up my beliefs. This is one that says, I will die before I will break the Sabbath. This is one that says, I will give my body to be burned for God. But have not love, it profits me nothing. Wow. It doesn't matter what we do or what we teach without love. Yes, the world needs love. The world needs love. But of all places on earth, the church should always be a place where love is found. The church should be a place where we bear with one another, where we suffer long with one another. The church should be a place where we model forgiveness, where we model forgiving one another, where we model loving one another, where we model bearing long with one another, where we long to serve and to do for others, where we put others before ourselves. The church should be a place where the love of God, the sacrificial, serving love of God, the unifying love of God, the forgiving love of God should be seen. For by this all will know that we are his disciples. And not only must we love one another, the church should be a safety net for hurting, wounded, struggling souls. God's church should be a place of acceptance. not condemnation and rejection. A place of unity, not division. A place for encouragement and support, not ridicule. But today, do people see love and do they find love in God's church? In Pastor Dwight Nelson's book titled The 11th Commandment, he shares a story regarding an AIDS victim. And I want to read that story to you. I want to read it as he shared it. He actually shared it as a letter. He got a letter from a fellow pastor. And this is what the letter said. Dear Pastor Nelson, this was written quite some years ago. Okay, probably, I'm guessing, like in the 90s or early 2000s, although I don't have a date for it. Dear Pastor Nelson, about 5 years ago, another close friend of mine died of AIDS. His name was Jack, and he died at the age of 34. Jack was baptized as an Adventist about 15 months before he died, and I knew him mainly from the weekly prayer meetings. Jack was infected with HIV several years prior to his joining the church. He never even knew he had HIV until he got pneumonia. He survived the pneumonia, met some neighbors who were Adventists, and came into the truth through them. Unfortunately, a few members of the church could not accept Jack because he had AIDS. Some stopped going to church and prayer meeting because Jack was there. And they feared catching AIDS from the air or sitting in the same room as him. My former pastor tried very hard to educate these people, but they didn't want to hear it. When the pastor spent time in the hospital with Jack every day before he passed away, they would say something like, I hope our pastor doesn't get AIDS in the hospital and come back and give it to all of us. How angels must weep in heaven for the hardness of hearts, even of professed Christians. Thank the Lord, Jack remained faithful until the end and even had a spirit of love and forgiveness toward those members who shunned him. Jack knew how much Jesus loved him, and that was enough. Jesus said, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you should also love one another. You know, the command to love was not new. We find it all through the Old Testament, in fact. In Deuteronomy 6:5, it says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. In Leviticus 19:18, we read, love your neighbor as yourself. This was a principle God gave his people all through the Old Testament, to love the Lord your God with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So how is it new? It is new in which Jesus demonstrated love, and now he is asking his followers to emulate him. It is new because Jesus did not just give the command to love one another. Jesus gave the command to love one another as I have loved you. That's how you should love one another. Jesus has raised the bar. Jesus has raised the standard of love. He's taken love to levels that nobody ever knew or saw before. Jesus is not just repeating the former command to love. He is now that he has come and demonstrated love in the highest level, Jesus says, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. You see, Jesus taught things like, but I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. Jesus is saying even those that are not lovable. Jesus is saying those that irritate us. Jesus is saying even those who do evil against you, love them. Pray for them. Pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. You see, Jesus has taken it to a new level. It's not even just a command to love. It's a command to love as Jesus loved. To go beyond the command of love your neighbor as yourself, but to love your neighbor as Jesus loved your neighbor. To love the unlovable. To love the unlovely. to love, as he did in his day, the sinners and the tax collectors and the most outcast and the rejected. We can look at many examples of how Jesus loved. But perhaps we should look at the context of when he said those words, to love as I have loved you. Because he spoke those words in the upper room. He spoke those words in the upper room the night before his crucifixion, just hours before he would be arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. And when his disciples could have been saying, what can we do for you? How can we help? We're going to be there for you. What can we do? How can we help? Instead, his own disciples were arguing among themselves. His own disciples were bickering and arguing over who was going to get the best seat, who was going to get the greatest position in the kingdom, still thinking that Jesus was going to set up an earthly kingdom. They still did not understand that Jesus was going to die on the cross. They were waiting for him, like all the Jews, for the Messiah to overthrow the Romans and set up a kingdom. And they were arguing over who was going to get the highest positions, even as they entered this upper room to celebrate the Passover, the night before Jesus' crucifixion. And we know the story. The story of the foot washing, this task that was so menial that if a Jew had Gentile and Jewish slaves, even the Jewish slave didn't have to do it, but the Gentile slave did it. It's hard for us to comprehend the mentality of that because we don't do this in our homes today. But I liken it on one level of the normalcy of it, is if you had friends over and you were outside planting stuff in the garden or doing something like that, or working on your car, and then it was time to come in and eat, and you would provide opportunity for people to do what? Wash their hands before they ate. Well, in those days, it was just as customary for a feast like this to have the dirty feet from the walking with the sandals and in the dirt or muddy or nasty roads to wash their feet. But it was relegated to a servant. And like I said, if you had Gentile and Jewish servants, it was even beneath the Jewish servant. If you had a Gentile servant available, it had to be the Gentile. And now, not just a servant, but the master of all masters. The ones the disciples looked to as the Messiah, the one who they themselves considered to be the Son of God, even though they had wrong concepts of what the Messiah was supposed to do. They believed he was the Messiah. They believed he was the Son of God. And now Jesus, the Messiah, the master teacher, the Creator, has stripped to the waist and bowed down at the feet of these disciples and is washing their feet. We're familiar with this story, and we've heard it many times. Perhaps it doesn't have the impact it should. But it was life-changing and transformational for most of those disciples. Sister White says their hearts were changed because they could not comprehend Jesus doing what he was doing. And after he had washed their feet, he said, do you know what I've done? Do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. What is Jesus? If I, your Lord, have gotten down and served you and done the lowliest of things to care for you, then you ought to do that for one another. I wonder if we know what Jesus did. I wonder if we really understand it. Paul writes in Philippians chapter 2, let this mind be in you which was in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal. He was God. As we read in John, the Word was with God. The Word was God. And everything that was made by him. Nothing that was ever made was made without Jesus. Jesus made everything. Jesus made everything that was ever made. And John tells us nothing that was ever made was made without Jesus. Nothing came into existence except through Jesus bringing it into existence. Jesus himself, God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men, and being found in the appearance of a man. We cannot even comprehend what that means. We cannot comprehend what the omnipotent majesty of the God, creator of the universe, the sovereign God, found in fashion as a man. And then, not only that, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. This is what Jesus has done for us. Are we willing to humble ourselves as did our Creator? To be less concerned about what I deserve, to be less concerned about my rights, my opinions, my worship style, my preferences, my ideas of how things should be done, but instead to love and embrace others and to put others first. Jesus said, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you. That you love one another, that all may know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. Jesus was about to demonstrate the greatest act of love in the history of the universe when he gave himself on the cross. Dwight Nelson writes in his book, The 11th Commandment, what will make this old command so dramatically new, the command to love, the new commandment to love? For these upper room disciples, that is that in less than 24 hours they will be witnesses to a bloody love so radical that will forever rewrite the definition of love in the human language. Yes, the Son of God willingly laying down his life for his children. The Creator dying for his creatures, his creation. And even saying, Father, forgive them. They don't understand what they're doing. Some of you may recall a number of years ago, in fact, in January of 1982, the Air Florida flight that was taking off from Reagan International Airport, at that time I think it was called Washington National Airport, and almost immediately after takeoff, the plane crashed into a bridge and down into the freezing Potomac River. The waters, it was January in D.C., the waters were icy cold. And immediately there were helicopters hovering over it, seeking for survivors, of which there were only about 5 survivors of the crash. But of those that were surviving and fighting for survival in those icy waters that night, that plane crashed, the helicopters hovered over and they let down a life ring. There was a man bobbing to try to stay above the water, and they let down the life ring to this man. And instead of allowing them to lift him to safety, he passed it to another person that was trying to survive the water to stay alive. And they lifted this person up and took him over to the shore and let him down. And then they came back and they let this life ring back down to the same man, still trying to bob, his head bobbing in the water, trying to stay above the water. And they lifted it down to him again that he might be rescued. But there was another person over here, and he took it and he gave it to them. And they lifted that person to safety, and they brought it back, and they dropped it down yet again to this man, this life ring. And he took the life ring, and he saw another person, and he gave it to them. And they lifted them to safety. And he returned one more time to lift down to this man, to rescue him. And he was gone. He had succumbed to the freezing waters and lost his life, having passed that life ring to, we believe, I think it was 4 other people. President Ronald Reagan touched the heart of our nation in a national address, speaking of that stranger's self-sacrificing bravery when he quoted the words of Jesus found in John 15:13, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. And yet this man laid down his life for strangers. How do we love like that? How do we love as Jesus loved? Well, to be honest with you, of ourselves, we can't. You and I are not capable of loving like that. But if we will allow Jesus to come in, if we will allow Jesus to come in and inhabit our hearts, then Jesus will love others like that through us. And that's what we have to do as Christians. We studied this verse in Sabbath school a few weeks ago. John 15, verse 4, Jesus said, abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. We can't bear that kind of fruit. We can't love like that. But if we abide in Jesus and Jesus in us, he will produce the fruit of love in us. Jesus said, I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without me you can do nothing. Brothers and sisters, the only way we can love as Christ loved is to allow it to be Jesus loving in us and through us. The only way we can fulfill this command is every day invite Jesus into our heart. Jesus said, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hear my voice, I will come into him and dine with him and he with me. Jesus said, if you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him? We need to ask for the Spirit and be filled with Jesus every day so that he can love through us. I don't have time to share the stories now, but I think of stories from Bill Liversidge used to share where he would be put in situations calling for forgiveness or compassion. He was like, Lord, I don't have the forgiveness or compassion I need. I need you to come in. I need the compassion of Jesus to come in and love this person. And he would just give himself to Jesus and let the Spirit come in and take over the situation where naturally he couldn't love like that. You know, I'm definitely not a scientist, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I read somewhere that about how a sponge is unique in its ability to absorb and obtain waters. And if what I read is correct, it says that how is a sponge filled? It says a sponge has many separate individual chambers. So a sponge is made up of these individual, like maybe 100 or however many different separate chambers. And he said as a sponge is put in water, it begins to absorb the water, but it begins to absorb the water one chamber at a time. And it fills up these different chambers in the sponge. And so drop by drop, the more the sponge is immersed in the water, it fills up each chamber by chamber, until the sponge becomes all the innermost chambers are filled, and the sponge becomes utterly saturated with water. Every chamber is filled to the max, and the sponge is now overflowing with water. And I don't know if that's 100% correct or if it works for every sponge that way, but I can tell you that that's the way it needs to work in the Christian life. It's the only way we can love as Jesus loved, and that's to abide in Jesus and allow Jesus to come into us every day more and more, to allow the Spirit of God to come into us, to fill every chamber of our bodies, every nook and cranny of our bodies, every cell of our bodies, until we are filled up and overflowing with the love of Jesus. We need to become saturated with the love of Jesus. We need to absorb all of Jesus that we can and let his love flow through us to those around us. Philip Yancey shared a story in one of his books of a pastor friend of his who was working with the Down and Out in Chicago at one time. And he told the story of a prostitute who came to him in dire straits. This prostitute was homeless, was sick, did not even have enough food to buy for her 2-year-old daughter, and shared how she had actually been renting her 2-year-old daughter out for sex. She was a total mess. The pastor said, I could hardly even believe my ears, the things that she shared with me. And at some point, the pastor said to this woman, he says, have you ever thought about going to a church for help? And he says, I will never forget the look of pure, naive shock that crossed her face. Church, she cried. Why would I ever go there? I'm already feeling terrible about myself. They'll just make me feel worse. And I would pray that that would never be the case with our church. I would pray that there would be no sinner, no person that's struggling with addictions or problems in this world that will come to us and be made to feel worse because they came to church in this terrible state that they may be in. You know, emergency rooms can become messy places because people come into emergency rooms in the middle of crisis. People in the emergency room go from this sterile clean, sanitized place. A room in the emergency room goes from being this clean, perfectly sanitized place to becoming filled with dirt and blood and vomit. You know, when people show up at the emergency room bloodied and bleeding from injuries, from car wrecks, from gunshot wounds, when people come into the emergency room throwing up from overdoses and different things, the doctors and the nurses don't say, whoa, wait a minute. We just got this place all cleaned up and sterilized. You go get yourself cleaned up. Go get cleaned up and come back and we'll help you. No, people come there soiled and sick and wounded and bleeding. They come for help. They come for healing. And so it should be with the church. So it should be with the disciples of Jesus. A church is a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints. Oh, that we can love as Jesus loved. You know, as I prepare to close, there's a couple of verses in Revelation we really like to use. Powerful verses because we believe that we are a remnant church of Bible prophecy. We believe that the Seventh-day Adventist church was raised up for a purpose, raised up to proclaim the three angels' message of Revelation 14, to tell the world that this is judgment hour, a church to call people back to God, to worshiping God and honoring and giving glory to Him and keeping His commandments. And we like Revelation 12:17 because it says, and the dragon, that being Satan, was enraged with the woman, being a church, and went to make war with the rest of her offspring. So if you look at the whole of chapter 12 of Revelation, it's talking about different episodes of Satan's attack. He rebelled in heaven. He tried to kill Jesus when he was born. He attacked the early Christian church. And now it's saying, in the end times, Satan is enraged because there's a church still doing what? After all of his deceptions and after Satan has caused all the world to go into false beliefs and false things, there's still a church keeping the commandments of God that have the testimony of Jesus. And the Bible identifies the remnant church of Bible prophecy as the church that Satan is angry with because it's the last church, it's the remnant church who are still keeping the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. And of course, Revelation 14:12 says, here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. And so we like that because we believe in the importance of these things. And our church is a church who keeps all the commandments, all 10, including the Sabbath commandment. And we believe in the testimony of Jesus. And I know that Revelation 19:10 says this testimony of Jesus is what? The spirit of prophecy. And we believe that our church was given the gift of prophecy through Ellen White. And I don't want to misuse any statement, any verse in the Bible ever. And I know that we rightly use this. And I know that 19:10 says the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. And there's several ways to interpret that in terms of prophecy and the prophetic movement. But I want to consider one other possible application, one other at least spiritual insight to these words at the very best. When we talk about the testimony, when you talk about the testimony of somebody, what does that mean? If I say, come up here and give us your testimony, Matt, what's he going to do? He's going to give his testimony of what? What he believes, what he thinks, or what he saw in a situation, right? If a witness is called up to the witness stand to give a testimony, they're testifying about what they saw or witnessed or believe or think about something, right? What was the testimony of Jesus about the Ten Commandments? What he did say, not one law or jot or tittle will be changed from the law. But when he was asked about the greatest of the commandments, we read in Matthew, then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him, saying, Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang the law and the prophets. What does Jesus say? He's not saying the Ten Commandments don't apply. He's saying the Ten Commandments are based upon these two fundamental principles. Loving God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. This is what the law hangs on. Love. Love to God and love to man. And then Jesus, on the night before his crucifixion, said, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. And isn't this what Jesus testified of? And let me add that verse. And isn't this what Jesus testified in the parable in Matthew 25 when he's talking about the end of time, when the Son of Man shall come in the clouds of glory with all of his angels, and he shall divide the people into two groups, and there shall be the sheep on one side and the goats on the one side. This is the saved and the lost. And how did he differentiate between the two groups, the saved and the lost? As much as you did it unto me. And to them you did it unto me. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was in prison, you visited me. When I was sick, you came to me. When I was naked, you gave me clothes. And one group said, Lord, when did we see you hungry? When did we see you hungry and not offer you food? As much as you didn't do it unto the least deserving, the least lovely, the least person, you didn't do it for me. And to those who he says, when I was hungry, you fed me, and when I was in prison, they said, Lord, when did we feed you? When did we visit you in prison? Whenever you did it to the lowest, least person on earth that I died for, you did it to me. Brothers and sisters, if we are God's last day people, if we are God's church, if we are ambassadors of his kingdom, sons and daughters of the King, the defining characteristic must be manifested in us and among us. It matters not what else we believe or teach if we do not have love. Paul says it's worth nothing. By God's grace, may we commit today to abiding in Jesus daily, absorbing his love so much that the love of Jesus will flow through us to those around us. There's a song I grew up singing, and I asked several people, they didn't know it, and Matt and Jennifer didn't know it well enough to play it, and I asked Brother Stephen, and he didn't know it well enough to play it, but some of you will know that song. It says, we're not going to sing it, but I want to read the words. The first part, it says, we are one in the Spirit. We are one in the Lord. We are one in the Spirit. We are one in the Lord, and we pray that our unity will one day be restored. And they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they will know we are Christians by our love. A new commandment I give to you, Jesus said, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you love one another. By this, all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another.